Welcome to the Common Historian podcast, where tonight we explore the shadows cast by Europe's most fascinating and frightening past. I'm your host, Jeremy, and today we're embarking on a journey through stone corridors where the past refuses to stay buried. Picture this. You're standing in a medieval castle at midnight. The wind howls through ancient stones, and somewhere in the darkness, you hear footsteps that have no owner. Tonight, we're exploring five European castles where history's darkest moments seem to have left permanent impressions, not just in books, but in the very fabric of reality itself. These aren't just tourist attractions with spooky marketing campaigns. These are places where documented historical atrocities occurred, where real people lived, suffered, and died in ways that make even hardened historians pause. The questions we're exploring tonight is whether extreme human suffering can actually imprint itself on a location and where some souls never truly find peace. So pour yourself some warm, turn down the blankets, and join me as we unlock the doors to Europe's most haunted castles. Our first destination takes us to the misty hills of County Offaly, Ireland, where Leap Castle stands like a wounded giant against the sky. Now, I've researched hundreds of alleged haunted locations, but Leap Castle's history is so brutal, so utterly soaked in violence, that even skeptics find themselves unsettled by its legacy. Let me paint you a picture of medieval Ireland. We're talking about the 13th and 14th century, where clan warfare was a way of life, and betrayal was common as morning mist. The O'Carroll clan, who built Leap Castle, weren't just warriors. They were notorious for their cruelty, even by medieval standards. The castle most infamous space is what locals call the Bloody Chapel. Now, chapels were supposed to be sanctuaries, places of peace and worship. But in 1532, something happened here that would stain their sacred space forever. Teague O'Carroll, chieftain of the clan, was attending Mass in this very chapel when his brother, who happened to be the family priest, was conducting the service. What triggered the violence? Some say it was a dispute over succession. Others claim it was about a woman. But in the middle of the Holy Mass, with the altar lit by candlelight and incense burning, Teague drew his sword and murdered his own brother, a priest, right there at the altar. Can you imagine the shock? The absolute violation of everything sacred? The priest's blood literally soaked into the altar's stone. But that's just one murder among hundreds. The O'Carrolls had a particularly twisted method of hospitality. They would invite rival clan members to dinner, seat them at their table, break bread with them, then, mid-meal, give a signal. Suddenly, the guests would find themselves surrounded by armed men. They weren't just killings, they were psychological torture sessions designed to terrorize anyone who might oppose the O'Carrolls. Now, here's where the story gets truly horrifying. In the early 1900s, renovation work was done on the castle. Workers were clearing out what they thought to be just an old storage room when they discovered something that made hardened construction workers physically ill. Hidden beneath the floor was the oubliette, a dungeon accessible only from above through a trapdoor. When they lowered the lights into this pit of despair, they found it filled with human skeletons, not just a few, hundreds. And here's the truly gruesome part. At the bottom of this dungeon were iron spikes. Prisoners weren't just thrown down there to starve, they were impaled as they fell, left to die in agony, while their cries echoed up through the single opening above. The workers found skeletons of men, women, and even children. Some showed signs of having lived for days after their fall, their bones bearing evidence of desperate attempts to climb the smooth walls. One skeleton was found clutching a pocket watch stopped at 11:47. Whether that was AM or PM, we'll never know. But someone's final moments were marked by that timepiece. Modern visitors to Leap Castle report encounters with multiple entities. There's the priest, still trying to finish his final mass. There are dinner guests, still trying to escape their fatal meal. But the most terrifying is something locals call simply it. Described as a small, gray, humanoid creature with the face of a rotting corpse and an overwhelming stench of sulfur and decay. Paranormal investigators who have spent nights in Leap Castle describe an oppressive atmosphere that seems to physically press down on visitors. They report hearing banging from inside the walls, as if someone or many someones are trying to escape. Temperatures drop to 20 to 30 degrees in specific locations, and that smell, that putrid odor that seems to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. What makes Leap Castle's haunting so compelling to researchers is how specifically they correlate with documented historical events. This isn't vague, spooky feelings. They're the reported phenomena directly connect to verified atrocities committed here. It is as if the sheer magnitude of suffering has somehow scarred the location itself. From Ireland, we travel east to the dark forests of the Czech Republic, about 47 kilometers north of Prague, where we find perhaps the most conceptually terrifying castle in all of Europe. Huska's Castle. What makes this castle unique isn't just its hauntings, it's the very reason it was built. Most castles were constructed for obvious purposes: defense, residence, controlling trade routes, or displaying power. Huska Castle serves none of these functions. It has no water source. It is not of any strategic route. It wasn't built to house a large population. In fact, when you look at the historical records, Huska Castle appears to have been built for one reason only: to contain something. The legend goes back to the 13th century, before the castle existed. Local villagers spoke in whispers about a hole in the forest floor, a chasm so deep that no one had ever found the bottom of it. But it wasn't just the depth that terrified them. They claimed that horrible sounds emerged from the pit, inhuman screams, the flapping of massive wings, and voices speaking in tongues that hurt to hear. The hole became known locally as the gateway to hell, and villagers developed a grim method of dealing with condemned prisoners. Instead of hanging or beheading them, they would lower criminals into the pit on ropes, offering pardons to anyone willing to be lowered down and report what they saw. The stories that emerge from these expeditions are the stuff of nightmares. One prisoner, lowered down by 50 feet, began screaming to be pulled up immediately. When they hauled him to the surface, his hair had turned completely white, and he appeared to have aged decades in minutes. He claimed to have seen winged creatures with human torsos climbing the walls, reaching for him with clawed hands. Another condemned man was lowered further down. The rope went slack, and when they pulled it up, they found that he was dead, but not from falling. His body bore claw marks, bite wounds from something with fangs, unlike any earthly creature. His face was frozen in an expression of such terror that several villagers became physically ill just looking at him. By the mid 13th century, the local nobility decided something had to be done. King Ottokar II of Bohemia commissioned the construction of Huska Castle with very specific architectural requirements. The Gothic chapel was to be built directly over the hole, with the altar positioned precisely above the opening. Beneath the chapel floor, they placed massive stone slabs sealed with blessed mortars and religious symbols. But here's what's truly unsettling. The construction workers themselves reported strange incidents. They claimed as they worked, particularly near the pit, they could hear scratching sounds from below the stones, as if something was trying to claw its way out. Several workers reported seeing dark shapes moving in their peripheral vision, and two construction workers simply vanished, never to be found. The chapel was built over this supposed gateway is unlike any other religious space I've encountered in my research. The artwork is bizarrely focused on scenes of demonic torment and apocalyptic imagery, unusual themes for a standard medieval castle. It's almost as if the artists were influenced by something otherworldly. Forward to World War II, and Huska Castle's dark reputation attracted some very sinister attention. The Nazis, particularly those involved in the Honorary, their occult research division, occupied the castle from 1940 to 1945. Declassified documents suggest they were conducting experiments related to what they called dimensional gateways. Local Czech resistance fighters reported seeing strange lights emanating from the castle at night and hearing sounds that seemed to come from beneath the earth itself. Modern paranormal investigators face unique challenges at Huska. Electronic equipment frequently malfunctions, particularly in the chapel area. Investigators report overwhelming feelings of dread that actually increase the closer they get to the altar. Some have described hearing what sounds like hundreds of voices whispering in unison from below the floor, always in languages they can't identify. The most disturbing report involved visual phenomena. Visitors claimed to see dark human-like shapes with glowing eyes watching from the shadows. These figures seem to be aware of observers and will move to stay out of the direct sight. One investigator described it as being hunted by shadows that think. What makes Huska Castle so uniquely terrifying isn't just the paranormal reports, it's the architectural evidence that supports the legend. When researchers examined the castle's foundation, they found that the chapel area required significantly more stone and reinforcement than necessary for a building of its size. It is if the builders were trying to create an unbreakable seal. Whether or not there actually is a gateway to hell beneath Huska Castle, something about this location has inspired centuries of fear. Perhaps most unsettling of all, the scratching sound from beneath the chapel floor continues to this day. Now we venture into the Carpathian Mountains of Romania, where Braun Castle perches on its rocky outcrop like something from a Gothic nightmare. While millions of tourists visit Dracula's castle each year, the real history of Braun is far more complex and in many ways more disturbing than any vampire legend. Let's separate fact from fiction. Vlad III, known as Vlad the Impaler or Vlad Dracula, likely spent very little time at Braun Castle. The connection between this fortress and the historical figure who inspired Bram Stoker's Count Dracula is largely marketing. But don't let that disappoint you. The true history of Braun Castle is drenched in enough real blood to satisfy any horror enthusiast. Built in the 14th century, Braun Castle served as a customs fortress and later as a royal residence. But during the medieval period, it also functioned as a court of justice and execution site. The castle's dungeon housed accused witches, plague victims, and political prisoners. Medieval justice was swift and brutal, and bronze executioners were known for their creativity. One particular grim period occurred during the 15th century, when the castle was used as a quarantine site during plague outbreaks. Suspected plague victims were brought here not for treatment, but for isolation until death. The castle's lower chamber became mass graves, with bodies burned in a pit that still exists beneath the current tourist areas. But perhaps the most disturbing chapter in Braun's history involved the witch trials of the 16th century. During this period, suspected witches were brought to Braun for testing. These tests include the notorious trial by water, where victims were thrown into the castle well. If they sank and drowned, they were innocent. If they somehow survived, they were obviously witches and were burned at the stake. One legend that persists involves a woman named Rosa, who was accused of cursing the castle's water supply. According to court records, she was subjected to torture for 3 days before confessing to consorting with demons. Her execution was particularly gruesome. She was walled alive into the castle foundation as both punishment and protection against her alleged curses. Modern visitors to Braun Castle report phenomenon that seems centered around the areas with the darkest history. The well, where accused witches were drowned, is particularly a hot spot for paranormal activity. Visitors report hearing splashing sounds when the well is empty, and some claim to see wet handprints appearing on the stone walls nearby. The former torture chambers, now part of the museum's historical exhibits, are where many visitors report the most intense experiences. Sudden temperature drops, feelings of being watched, and an overwhelming sense of sadness are commonly reported. Some visitors become physically ill in these areas, describing nausea and dizziness that disappears as soon as they leave the chamber. Photography seems to capture unusual phenomenon at Braun. Visitors frequently review their photos to find unexplained mists, shadow figures, and what appears to be faces in the windows that were empty when the photo was taken. The castle staff has collected hundreds of these anomalous photographs over the years. What's particularly interesting about Bronze Castle's hauntings is how they differ from Dracula's legend. Instead of a single powerful vampire entity, witnesses report encounters with multiple spirits, women in medieval dresses, possibly the accursed witches, plague victims in various states of decay, and shadowy figures that seem to be reliving their final moments of torture. The current caretakers of the castle acknowledge these reports, but approach them with a mixture of respect and practical acceptance. As one longtime staff member told me, the castle has seen much suffering. It would be it would be stranger if there were no echoes of that pain. Perhaps atop Castle Rock, an, ex- an extinct volcano in the heart of Scotland's capital, Edinburgh Castle has dominated the skyline for over 9 centuries. With such long and violent history as a military fortress, royal residence, and prison, it perhaps inevitable that Edinburgh Castle would be one of the most haunted locations in Scotland. What makes Edinburgh Castle unique among haunted locations is the sheer volume and variety of paranormal phenomena reported here. We're not talking about a single ghost or a simple haunting. This is an entire supernatural ecosystem that seems to have developed over nearly a millennium of human suffering. Let's start with the most famous resident spirit, the headless drummer. First documented in 1650, this phantom musician is said to appear before times of great danger to the castle. His drumming was reportedly heard before Oliver Cromwell's attack, before the Jacobite sieges, and even before the World Wars. Witnesses described the sound as distinctly different from living drummers, more resonant, echoing from everywhere and nowhere at once. But the headless drummer is just the beginning. The castle, St. Margaret's Chapel, the oldest building on the site, is home to what locals call the Weeping Woman. She's believed to be a spirit of a medieval lady who lost her child during a siege. Visitors report hearing inconsolable sobbing, even when the chapel is empty, and some claim to see the figure in white kneeling at the altar. The dungeon tells perhaps the most horrific stories. During various conflicts, including the Seven Years' War, the American Revolutionary War, and the Napoleonic Wars, these chambers held prisoners from around the world. Conditions were deliberately brutal. Prisoners were given minimal food, no heat, and were often shackled to the walls for months and years at a time. French prisoners from the Napoleonic Wars left behind some of the most poignant evidence of their suffering. Carved into the dungeon walls, you can still see their desperate messages, names, dates, prayers, and countdown marks, tracking their imprisonment. One inscription reads, Mont pour la Patrie, or Dead for the Fatherland, carved by a prisoner who died in his chains. American prisoners from the Revolutionary War also left their mark. Naval personnel captured from the colonial ships were held in conditions so poor that the survival rate was less than 50%. Their ghosts are reportedly among the most active in the dungeons, with visitors frequently reporting being touched by invisible hands and hearing voices speaking in colonial American accents. But perhaps the most disturbing area of the castle is the area known as the South Bridge Vaults. Discovered in the 1980s, these underground chambers were sealed for centuries, and when they were reopened, investigators found evidence of activities that went far beyond simple imprisonment. In these vaults, archaeologists discovered implements of torture, human remains, and evidence that of what appeared to have been ritual sacrifices. Some historians believe these chambers were used for unofficial executions, prisoners who simply disappeared from the records. The Scottish legal system of the medieval period had numerous ways for people to vanish without a trace. In 2001, Edinburgh Castle became the site of one of the largest scientific investigations into paranormal phenomenon ever conducted. Dr. Richard Wiseman from the University of Hertfordshire, along with other researchers, brought 240 volunteers to the castle. These volunteers had no knowledge of the castle's haunted reputation or its history. The results were remarkable. Nearly half of the volunteers reported unusual experiences. The location where they felt the strongest phenomenon directly correlated with the areas of the castle associated with the most violence and death. The dungeons, the vaults, and the areas around the former execution sites all triggered strong responses. One of the most compelling aspects of this study was that the volunteers described experiences that matched historical accounts of paranormal activity at the castle, despite having no prior knowledge of these reports. They described feeling watched, sudden temperature changes, and even specific sounds like drumming and weeping, all phenomenon that had been reported for centuries. The castle ghost tours, which run nightly, have documented thousands of unusual photographs over the years. These images frequently show unexplained lights, shadow figures, and what appears to be a face in the windows of areas that were empty at the time of the photography. What's particularly fascinating about Edinburgh Castle is how the hauntings seem to reflect the diversity of the people who suffered there. Reports include Scottish Highlanders, French soldiers, American colonists, and even German prisoners from both world wars. It's as if the castle has become a repository for the restless spirits of everyone who died within its walls, regardless of their nationality or the century in which they lived. The current staff at Edinburgh Castle take the paranormal reports seriously. not as a marketing gimmick, but as part of the castle's historical legacy. As one longtime guard said, you can't have this much history, this much pain, without something remaining. The stones remember what we try to forget. Our final stop takes us to the Loire Valley of France, where Chateau de Briscus rises 7 stories into the sky, earning its nickname the Giant of the Loire Valley. This Renaissance masterpiece appears to be a epitome of French elegance and nobility. But beneath its beautiful facade lies one of the most persistently documented hauntings in European history. The story begins in the 15th century with a tale of passion, betrayal, and numerous revenge that reads like a tragic opera. Jacques de Brise, the chateau owner, was a man of considerable power and equally considerable temper. His wife, Lady Charlotte de Brise, was known for her beauty, and unfortunately for her, her indiscretions. According to the court records and family documents, Charlotte began an affair with Pierre de Lavergne, one of the chateau's huntsmen. Medieval aristocratic marriages were often political arrangements, but adultery, particularly by a noblewoman, was not just a personal betrayal, it's a threat to family honor and lineage legitimacy. Jacques discovered the affair in the most dramatic way possible. On a cold December night in 1477, he returned unexpectedly from a hunting trip to find Charlotte and Pierre together in what is now called the Green Room. The scene that unfolded was swift and brutal. Jacques, in a jealous rage, killed both with his hunting knife, stabbing them repeatedly in what witnesses described as a frenzied attack. But here's where the story becomes more than just medieval tragedy. From the night of the murders, servants began reporting strange occurrences. They heard Charlotte's voice calling through the chateau corridors, particularly at dawn. They saw a woman in a green dress walking through rooms that were not supposed to be empty, that were supposed to be empty. What makes the Chateau de Briscas hauntings unique is its continuality and the openness of the family who has owned the property for over 500 years. The, the current Duke of Brisca, Charles and Andrew de Brisca, doesn't deny the presence of what the family calls La Dame Verte, the Green Lady. In fact, he speaks about her as if she's a if permanent, but if unwelcomed resident. The lady in green is most commonly seen in the tower room where the murders occurred. Guests who have stayed in this room, now a luxury accommodation for chateau visitors, describe awakening to find a woman in an elaborate green gown standing at the foot of their bed. But here's the truly unsettling detail. While her dress is clearly visible, her face appears to be missing, or rather appears to be a gaping black hole. The Duke himself had had encounters with the Green Lady. He described her as a presence that brings with it an overwhelming sense of sadness rather than fear. She seems to be searching for something. He said, he has said in interviews, perhaps forgiveness, perhaps just recognition of her tragedy. What's remarkable about the Briska haunting is how it's been documented across generations. Family records going back centuries, including references to the Green Lady, with descriptions that remain remarkably consistent across different time periods and witnesses who have had no contact with each other. Guests at the chateau have reported various phenomena beyond visual sightings. Many describe waking up in the green room to find their belongings moved or rearranged. Others report a strong scent of period perfume that seems to have no source. Some have found in handwritten notes in archonic French that seems to appear overnight, though the chateau staff insists that no one could have entered the second guest room, the secured guest rooms. Photos at the Chateau de Brest frequently capture anomalies. The Green Lady has appeared in numerous photos taken by guests, often visible in the mirror or window, even when no one was seen at the time the photo was taken. The chateau maintains a collection of those photographs, and consistency of these figures appear across different cameras, photographers, and time periods. It's generally striking. What makes this haunting particularly poignant is how it reflects the limited agency women had in medieval society. Charlotte's adultery, while morally questionable, was punishable by death, while men's fidelity were typically overlooked. Here's her restless spirit might represent not just her personal tragedy, but the broader injustice faced by women in this era. The current generation of the DeBriscus family has chosen to embrace their supernatural residents rather than attempt to exorcise her. They view the Green Lady as part of the chateau history and character. As the Dutch once remarked, she was here before us, and she'll likely be here after us. We've simply learned to coexist. As we end our journey through Europe's most haunted castles, I find myself reflecting on what connects these places beyond their supernatural reputation. Each of these locations was a site of extreme human emotions. Love turned into betrayal, power corrupted into cruelty, justice perverted with torture. What strikes me most about these hauntings is that they seem to preserve not just the memory of historical events, but the emotional resonance of human settings, their suffering. Whether you believe in the paranormal or a skeptic, these castles serve as tangible connections to our often brutal past. The question isn't really whether ghosts exist, it's whether places can hold memories, whether stones and mortars can absorb the intensity of of the human experience and somehow replay it across centuries. These castles suggest that perhaps the most traumatic moments in human history don't simply fade away. They become part of the fabric of the places where they occurred. For those brave enough to visit these locations, you're not just touring historical sites, stepping into the preserved scenes of humans' darkest chapters. You're walking where people live with their moments, where love turned into murder, where justice became vengeance. And perhaps that's what makes these hauntings so compelling. They remind us that history isn't just dates and facts and textbooks. It's an accumulated weight of human experience, both beautiful and terrible, that somehow manages to echo through me. Whether the spirits of Charlotte Debris, the prisoners of Edinburgh Castle, or the victims of Leap Castle, Oubliette, still walk these halls, their stories continue to move us. The tragedies continue to teach us, and their presence, real or imagined, continues to connect us with the full spectrum of human experience. Thank you for joining me on this journey through Europe's darkest corners. I'm Jeremy, the common historian. Until next time, remember that past is never truly past. It's always waiting just behind the next door, around the next corner, and in the next shadow that catches your eye.